Welcome to the first 8 weeks of Travels with Tulsans, which is sponsored by the Friends of the Tulsa City County Libraries. My name is Marion Sexton, and we are so glad to have you join us on this adventure. These weeks of Travels with Tulsans are being recorded, as you just heard, so you will soon be able to view any that you miss on the Tulsa Library YouTube channel. If you would like more information about becoming a friend of the library, visit tulsalibrary.org/friends. Be sure to join us next Wednesday for Yemen, presented by Roger Randall. This year, the link that you use today is good for each of the 8 weeks. You do not need a new link each week. If you lose your link, though, email friends@tulsalibrary.org to request one. Since you already have your link that you use today, feel free to share it with all of your friends. Our traveler today is Bobbie Bigby, taking us to Cambodia and the Empire of Angkor. During the presentation, please put any questions you have for Bobbie in the chat, and she will be able to respond at the end. Bobbie Bigby is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and a native of Tulsa. Bobbie has BA degrees in Chinese language and literature, as well as anthropology. She obtained her MA degree in International Studies, Peace, and Conflict Resolution at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia, as a Rotary Peace Fellow from 2014 to 2015. Bobbie also holds an MS degree in Arts and Culture Administration as an AIANTA scholar from Drexel University. Bobbie completed her thesis research on examining the potential for cultural tourism development among tribal nations, Quapaw, Shawnee, and Miami tribes in far northeastern Oklahoma. Bobbie has engaged in research focused on Indigenous peoples, tourism, and connections to traditional culture in China, India, Cambodia, Myanmar, Australia, and back home in Oklahoma Indian country. Bobbie is currently based between Broome, Australia, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is a long commute, and where she is pursuing a PhD at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, focused on comparative Indigenous cultural tourism. This research is being supported through the West Australian government's JTSI Science Tourism Fellows Program and the university's research training program. Bobbie is also engaged in co-editing and co-writing a book focused on re-examining the possibilities for tourism post-COVID-19 and the ways that tourism can better support social and ecological justice. Bobbie has a deep passion for Indigenous participation in tourism and believes that tourism can be used as a tool for culture and language revitalization, along with environmental stewardship. Please welcome Bobbie Bigby.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Marion. I am very pleased to be with everybody today. I just want to make sure that there isn't any feedback, and I am going to try and share my presentation screen. Okay. Hopefully everybody is seeing this successfully. So good morning again, everyone. My name is Bobbie Bigby. And as Marion had said, I am born and raised from Tulsa and very happy and proud to be here now. Tulsa is and always has been home, but I've been very fortunate to have also had experiences in traveling abroad and working abroad. And so today I want to be able to share the particular experience that I had over 2.5 years in Cambodia right after my undergraduate studies, because Cambodia is just a very, very significant place that I think kind of in, maybe the American imagination or Western imagination, it's really associated a lot with civil war and the genocide. that happened, which, you know, I will address, but there's much, much more to be seen and to be understood about the country and its very rich culture. And so today's presentation, I'll cover lots of parts of kind of my experiences and time there, what I was doing there. But I also tailored the presentation to people who might be interested in traveling in Cambodia and just understanding some of the basic things that you need to know about currency or seasons and things that kind of turn, some of our assumptions about travel kind of upside down on their heads, and that I think are helpful for anyone considering traveling to Cambodia, which I highly, highly recommend. Just a note about COVID. Cambodia has definitely been impacted by COVID, as has a lot of mainland Southeast Asia. But I think comparatively speaking, it, alongside Vietnam and Thailand, has managed things a lot better. There are still, you know, some important restrictions in place for people who are considering going. I wouldn't recommend going within the next couple of months, just as Omicron and COVID is, you know, is raging throughout the world and here in Oklahoma in the US. But overall, I think that Cambodia is very proud of its progress in how it's handled COVID. So with that, I'll start off and just give a little bit of an orientation looking at the map. Cambodia geographically is one of the smaller nations of mainland Southeast Asia here, but it's wedged between Thailand, Vietnam, and then you have Laos to the north. This map here on the right side shows some of the major cities in Cambodia. The capital is Phnom Penh. But the major area that attracts a lot of tourists, a lot of researchers, is the city of Siem Reap, here kind of in its northwest. And this is because Siem Reap is located right next to the temples and immense ruins of the Angkor Wat, which is really the legacy of the Angkor Empire, of which Cambodia was the center for several centuries, and which we'll talk about. But then you also have some of the smaller cities that are a little bit more difficult to travel to. There are bus options, but definitely for any traveler to Cambodia, you need to know about the capital Phnom Penh and Siem Reap. Just some basic facts. And here to the right, you see the Cambodian flag with, of course, the Angkor Wat, the Angkor structures there that are really an important marker of pride for Cambodian identity. To the left, you see here the current monarch, King Sihamoni, and to the right, Prime Minister Hun Sen. So like I said, the capital is Phnom Penh, but the main tourist attraction would really be the city of Siem Reap. And so for people who are flying into Cambodia, there are more flights daily into Siem Reap than there are to the capital, Phnom Penh, just because of those tourist attractions. Cambodia has a population of 16.7 million, and it's largely a country with a very large young population. So a lot of people under 30, under 35, that in many cases don't have active memories of the Khmer Rouge regime and some of the years of civil war and conflict that we'll talk about. The language that's spoken is Cambodian, but you can also call it Khmer. And so these terms are kind of interchangeable. Cambodian and Khmer refer to the same thing. And so for language, for ethnicity, they're interchangeable terms. For the currency, which we'll talk about in a second, which is kind of interesting, they use both the Cambodian riel and US dollars. The main religion is Theravada Buddhism, which is practiced throughout most parts of Southeast Asia. And then, like I said, to the right and throughout Cambodia, you see along the streets pictures of King Sihamoni along with Prime Minister Hun Sen. Also to note that Cambodia, since the mid-90s, has been a parliamentary democracy, but the ruling party, the Cambodian People's Party, under Prime Minister Hun Sen, has been in power since the mid-90s. So it's certainly had a very long-standing, and many people would say authoritarian rule. So how I ended up in Cambodia, as Marian had said, I graduated from Washington University in St. Louis in 2009, and my studies were in anthropology and Chinese language. And with both of those fields, my interest was in looking specifically at tourism for indigenous communities in China, seeing how cultural tourism was used as a tool, not just for employment, economic empowerment, but more so as a tool for cultural empowerment and for keeping communities, such as indigenous communities, connected to their cultural traditions while being able to make a living from engaging with tourism and their culture. And so towards the end of my time at Washington University, I was encouraged to apply for a Fulbright scholarship. And as many of you may know, a Fulbright is an extraordinary program run by the United States Department of State that supports scholars, artists, researchers, both American and those from abroad, to have intercultural exchanges based upon a research project, teaching English, or a particular program of study. But really, kind of like Peace Corps, Fulbright is geared towards intercultural understanding and really promoting the value of understanding diverse cultures and making strong alliances between the US and other countries. So the project that I had proposed in my Fulbright research grant was similar to what I had been doing in China during my undergraduate studies, but I wanted to look at the Cambodian context of how tourism was being used and engaged with as a tool for revitalizing and bringing back traditional arts and culture. And as I'll explain about next, Cambodia is a very interesting place in which to do this because the traditional cultural heritage and arts, along with many other aspects of traditional life, were nearly wiped out during the genocide and during civil war. So I was partnered with a local nonprofit organization called Cambodian Living Arts. And over the Fulbright period, which was a 10-month period, I was able to be immersed in Khmer language study. I also studied quite a bit about the diverse art forms, specifically classical and folk dances. But these are just a couple of pictures that I took from early on in my early days of arriving in Cambodia and being immersed in the arts with one of the teachers of the classical orchestra that they call the Pinpiet, that is composed of a lot of different wooden xylophones and gongs. To the right here is a picture with master artist Kong Nai, who had survived the Khmer Rouge regime. He is a chapé player. A chapé is almost a long-necked guitar that is particular to Cambodia. But Master Kong Nai has been blind for almost all of his life, but is a very, very gifted musician and a wonderful teacher. So just a little bit more about Cambodian Living Arts. It's a nonprofit organization based in Cambodia, but was founded by the gentleman here to the left, whose name is Arn Chon Pond. And Arn is a Cambodian who had survived the genocide. And he made it as a refugee to the United States, but wanted to return to Cambodia and was haunted by what he had seen and experienced with the history and the genocide, and was determined to try to find many of the remaining artists and musicians, dancers that were still in Cambodia, still alive, and wanted to make sure that young people were learning these arts. So that's a little bit of the background behind Cambodian Living Arts, how it started, and how it's become one of the most successful organizations in really keeping Cambodian performing arts alive and connected to young people. I stayed on after my Fulbright time, after the 10 months, and really was able, I feel, to kind of get down to just a lot more on the ground work for the remaining 2 years that I stayed there. Again, I was working with Cambodian Living Arts, and the first position that I had, and this is where this picture is taken from, is I was able to assist in coordinating the 5th annual Cambodian Youth Arts Festival that brought Cambodian youth from all over the country into the capital and connected them with workshops and demonstrations and performances of all of these different traditional art forms. But I also stayed on afterwards with the organization and helped to develop their first sustainable tourism program, which today has evolved into what you see in the right-hand corner here called Experience, or Pisau in Cambodian language. And so I saw a need for this, not only because tourism was what I had studied about, prior to Cambodia and then during my time in Cambodia, but really because during my time with this organization, you would see lots of visitors, lots of tourists coming in with cameras, wanting to just observe the classes that were going on, wanting to learn about the arts, but it was very disruptive for these classes. And a lot of times for some of the arts teachers that didn't speak English. And so you would have these tourists, these visitors, these observers. And I just thought, I'm already convinced about the importance of tourism, but here you're seeing kind of a need and a gap where there needs to be kind of more borders and more kind of structure on tourism. And so working with the organization, I was able to help develop a sustainable tourism program where we would actually charge the visitors and the tourists for coming to observe these classes and these workshops. And like I said, even after my time in Cambodia wrapped up, this program has gone on and grown and now come to be comprised of many different programs, one of which are weekly performances that happen at one of the national museums in Cambodia. So that's just a little bit of background as to how I got to Cambodia, what I was doing there, why I stayed there. And so I will just kind of move on now to a little bit of background to understand Cambodia. So like I said, I think in the Western imagination, when you talk about Cambodia, one of the first things that comes to mind is the genocide and the trauma and what happened in the 20th century. But I think definitely just as important, if not more important, is understanding Cambodia's place in history. And so Cambodia was the center of the Khmer or Angkor kingdom that was active between about 800 and 1400 AD. So really several centuries where Cambodia in all of Asia was a very dominant superpower. And so even though Cambodia may look quite small on the map today, the Khmer, the Angkor kingdom really kind of went all the way from present day Burma, Myanmar, even to Vietnam. And under the reign of numerous kings that were revered as gods, including Jayavarman II, Jayavarman VII, it was under their reign that these immense temples were constructed. And so you see the famous temple of Angkor Wat, which is definitely the most well-known and famous image that I think a lot of people associate with Cambodia. But very interesting to note is that Cambodia, in being right at the heart of Southeast Asia, has had a lot of influence, certainly from China and Chinese culture, but I would say has had a much stronger influence culturally, religiously, politically from India and from South India. And so during this period of the Angkor Empire, you had, based on the monsoon winds and these natural weather patterns, you had these traders and political figures from India that would come and would exchange cultural and political and religious ideas with the Angkor kings at that time. And then the monsoon winds, when they would shift, they would take the Indian traders and politicians back. And so it's because of this that the Angkor Empire was first founded upon Hinduism rather than Buddhism. Buddhism only came as a later influence. And so, as I'll show later, in some of the really beautiful, intricate carvings throughout the Angkor temples, you will see many of the Hindu stories and myths there, along with Buddhist stories and images, but like I said, that came later. So the Angkor kingdom lasted up until the 1400s. And an important thing to also note is that the success of the kingdom for all of those centuries was largely built as well on a rice economy. So Cambodia is just an amazing place for growing rice. And this is really what had been the backbone of the Angkor Empire for many centuries. But by the 1860s, the French kind of come onto the stage with colonization. And Cambodia, after the fall of the Angkor Empire in the 1400s, had kind of endured these waves of colonization, starting with the Thais, then with the Vietnamese, and then, like I said, with the French coming on the scene in about the 1860s. And so Cambodia's history from that period has been much more tumultuous and marked by just a lot of difficulty under colonial regimes. And then moving into the 20th century, I think that many Cambodians, as there was also conflict growing in other parts of Southeast Asia, like Vietnam and like Laos, many of these, new nation states, after they had emerged from French colonization and being part of the French Indochine, had a lot of frustration in having been subjugated under this colonial experience for so long. And so in Cambodia in particular, this led to the rise of what was called the Khmer Rouge regime, or the Red Khmer, that was based somewhat in socialist communist ideas, but more so was based around the ideas of this man, the picture to the right, named Pol Pot, who had the idea of making Cambodia an agrarian utopia that was inspired in some ways by the Angkor Empire and its rice growing capabilities. But his thought was to make Cambodia a very proud and self-sufficient nation, where you would take the entire population of Cambodia, send them to the fields to grow rice, and then Cambodia would be restored to its previous glory as kind of this rice basket. And be able to be independent. But this vision was executed and came with horrible consequences. So the picture you see to the left is the Khmer Rouge takeover of Phnom Penh in April of 1975. And this is when the previous government of Cambodia fell, the Khmer Rouge took over and really made the entire population of Cambodia was sent to the fields to grow rice. Part of this, though, was also the belief that any people who had been educated, who were doctors, were teachers, even people who had glasses, were considered those people who were literate and thus educated. And as part of this return to an agrarian utopia and forced labor, essentially, many people were killed. So this is the reason why so many of the artists and culture bearers in particular faced mass murder in this genocide. So the Khmer Rouge regime lasted for a period of 4 years from 1975 to 1979, but obviously the impacts left from the number of people, the cultural knowledge that had been taken during the Khmer Rouge regime has left lasting impacts up until today. After the Khmer Rouge regime fell, Cambodia was once again occupied by Vietnam and continued to just have civil war going on in the country. So it's really been since the mid 1990s that there has been somewhat of a return to democratic rule, thanks to the UN and other international actors. But like I said, what I think needs to be highlighted in this very difficult history is the power of Cambodian arts. Like I said, because Cambodia was back in its day during the Angkor Empire, really a not only a political, but a cultural superpower. I think Cambodia really needs to be known for its diverse and rich arts legacy. So this extends from classical and folk dances to shadow puppets. Cambodia is the only where you see a lot of puppet art forms throughout a lot of Southeast Asia, from Indonesia to Burma. Cambodia is unique in that it is the only place that has this what's called spiked tom, or the large shadow puppets that are made of leather. And then you have a fire, and at nighttime, you see these shadow puppets that are so big that each one is operated by one man. Numerous poetry traditions and musical forms, musical instruments. Cambodia is just a place that I think needs to be known for its just very, very rich and diverse art forms. So a little bit of background on other aspects of Cambodia. The Khmer language, it's part of the Mon Khmer language family. So even though Cambodia is wedged between Thailand and Vietnam, and those are places that are a little bit more well known, the Cambodian language is unlike Thai or Vietnamese because it's not tonal. So there aren't tones like you have in Vietnamese or Chinese or Thai. I think another aspect about Cambodian language that makes it very interesting, but can be a little bit intimidating for people trying to learn, is that it has really complex clusters of consonants and vowels. And so a good example of this is the word for delicious and fragrant that you will hear a lot in Cambodia when people talk about the yummy food, and they will say, oh, chuing chang. So you hear that chuing chang, these clusters of consonants and vowels that I don't think I've heard in many other Asian languages or any other languages around the world. Cambodian also has its own script, kind of like Thai and Burmese and languages in India. It's based off of a Brahmi script from India. And one of the most unique things about this is that many of these Southeast Asian scripts, including Khmer, that are based off of Indian scripts, follow these very unique, there's an order for how you label the sounds. And so just for a brief example, the first is ga, ka, go, ko, ngo. So these sounds start off in the very back of your throat, and then you start to move. Then next, ja, cha, jo, cho, nyo. It moves to the next place in your mouth. And so you have, unlike kind of the English or Roman alphabet where you just have A, B, C, D, a lot of these scripts and languages that are derived from Indian influences, the order of the sounds is based on where you enunciate those sounds in the throat. So I find that just an extraordinary part of just the logics of this language. Here are Cambodian numbers. You'll often see when you're traveling in Cambodia, the normal, the Western Roman numerals. But you also find these are the Cambodian numbers. So we say Som, Moi, Pi, Bai, Bun, Bram, Brampi, Brampai, Brambun. So those are the numbers 0 to 9. Another interesting thing to note for Cambodia that I think helps to kind of get us out of just this dominant thinking of Northern Hemisphere seasons. We think that everywhere has a spring to winter, and that's not the case. So Cambodia, along with many places around the Indian Ocean, like India and even Northern Australia, has 3 different seasons. You have the cool season from December to February, and this is normally the season most people like to travel in. So it's very popular for tourists. The hottest season is from March to June. And then the rainy season, when you have just very, very strong monsoons almost every day coming in, is between July to November. So those are just some helpful things to keep in mind when you're planning a trip to Cambodia, or knowing those seasons. And another interesting thing about Cambodia is that you have to kind of look at its geography and ecology and understand that the movement of the water that you see in the rivers gives structure to the rest of the year. And what I mean by that is that in the center of Cambodia is here this lake called Tonle Sap, and it's right near Siem Reap and the Angkor temples. And it joins then eventually with the Mekong River that's coming down from Laos. But you have throughout most of the year, during the rainy season, that water fills the river and backs up into the Tonle Sap, and it backs up so much by November, by the end of the rainy season, that the water actually shifts course and flows backwards, back down. And so that movement of water, and when the water reverses course, then finally down in the Mekong, these are when you have large celebrations, Bon Om Tuk in November, some of the largest holidays in Cambodia. So I just think that this is an interesting part of the ecology and geography to know about this place. Just a little bit of background about Cambodian foods. Rice and fish are definitely the staples for most people. But while, Thai food and Vietnamese food may be more well-known, and here in the United States, Cambodian shares a lot of similarities, but I think is very, very distinctive. And one of the things that separates it from, especially from Thai food, is that Cambodians do not like very much spicy. They instead prefer sweet and salty. For their salty ingredient, one of the favored sources of a salty ingredient is a food called prahok. And that is one of the most difficult, I think, for a lot of Westerners to get used to. It's basically fermented fish, not just fish sauce, but the actual fermented fish. But it's in many different Cambodian dishes. And just like I said, offers more of that salty and kind of umami flavor that really doesn't even taste all that fishy in a lot of the dishes. For the sweet source, you get the palm sugar. Rather than white sugar, palm sugar gives this really very nice, almost like a brown sugar or molasses flavor. Cambodia is a wonderful place for a lot of fresh tropical fruits, including the durian, who many of you may know from other parts of Southeast Asia, that some people love, some people hate. But Cambodian food, you also see some Chinese and French influences from the colonial period. So things like baguettes, but also Chinese noodles. Some key dishes for those of you who would plan a trip to Cambodia that I recommend are the fish amok. This is similar to a fish curry, but again, not very spicy, cooked with coconut milk, cooked with lemongrass and fresh turmeric. Just Cambodians love the herbs and spices that are freshly pounded and ground. Lok lak is kind of a legacy, a little bit from the French. It's beef cooked in oyster sauce, and this is oftentimes, if you're not as adventurous of an eater, a really great dish to start out with. And then one of my favorites that's just a very true everyday Cambodian dishes called nom ban chok. And so it's basically fish curry with vermicelli noodles. So you see here the white, freshly pressed rice noodles you eat with a fish curry that again is a lot of fresh herbs, spices that are ground down, cooked into a curry. And then you top it all with more fresh vegetables. So one of the favorite Cambodian kind of vegetables are the banana flowers, the flowers that grow on the banana plant that when chopped up almost have the consistency of celery. Really good stuff. The money in Cambodia is very interesting to note. And my mom and I have a lot of funny stories about this because when she came to visit me, you know, I'd become so used to the monetary system in Cambodia and just having to go between two currencies. But this can be a little bit overwhelming for people when they first go. So you need to know, going to Cambodia, there are two different currencies that operate side by side, the Cambodian riel and US dollars. You can use either one. The current exchange rate has stayed about the same as it was when I lived there, which is about 4,000 riel equal $1 US. But the main thing to know is that when you are trying to exchange money, US dollars to Cambodian riel, you need to have very crisp, fresh 100 US dollar bills with no markings and that are preferably new. So not earlier than 2018, because there were numerous times when I went to little money converter shops on the road and they would look at it and I thought it looked fine and it was too old and they wouldn't take it. So that's just a peculiarity of Cambodia. So in kind of winding down and giving just some places that I think are key highlights for a first trip to Cambodia, for those of you who are interested. Most people, like I said, go to Phnom Penh, the capital, and also Siem Reap. So some of the main places that I would recommend going to in Cambodia would be the Royal Palace, which is near the Tonle Sap River. So it's right near the riverside, which people like to walk along, and you find food vendors and things like this. But the Royal Palace is an important place to see because, like I said, Cambodia is still a constitutional monarchy with a king. And so the royal family is an important part of Cambodian life. Next door to Cambodia is the Royal Palace is the National Museum. And you can see a lot of this Angkorian art from the Angkor Empire. But you can also see a show by the organization that I work for, Cambodian Living Arts. You can see a mix of these different dance and musical forms. Like I said, this area, this cultural area is right near the riverside, so that makes for a beautiful evening stroll. Cambodia is a wonderful place to experience Southeast Asian markets, open air markets, where you can just get lost in a maze of different food and cloth vendors and selling all sorts of things. But as I will show pictures, to experience parts of the recent history and the genocide, this is also an option. And I think something that's important for a lot of people to really understand this part of Cambodia's history. I will say that these two places, Tulsans Genocide Museum and the Chung Ek Genocide Center, which was one of the killing fields, I have gone to both of those places only one time, and I will only go one time because it is just a very emotional and difficult place to visit, but I think, again, important for understanding Cambodia's recent history. So these are some pictures. This is the National Museum right next door to the Royal Palace, and where Cambodian Living Arts still has the weekly dance and music shows. This is Sa Thom Thmai, or the New Market, which is in this kind of almost Art Deco French style building that has one of Cambodia's largest kind of open air markets where you can find almost anything. Inside one of these markets, where again, all sorts of food, all sorts of bags and handmade items. But then this is a picture of Tulsang, which I said is the Genocide Museum. It was Tulsang was at one time a school, but during the Khmer Rouge regime was converted into a detention center and an execution spot. And so these pictures that line the walls are the pictures of people before they were murdered. So again, just very difficult history to process, but an important part of understanding Cambodia. The second kind of just list of highlights would be in the Siem Reap area. Of course, I recommend for anyone and everyone going to see the temples of the Angkor Empire. But the important thing I think to know is that there are numerous temples, and you don't have to go and see every one of them. And I think one of the best things is going and seeing temples that are smaller and in more remote locations. So while Angkor Wat is the main place where people go for sunrise and sunset shots, and you see some of the most intricate carvings on the wall. There are just know that there are many other temples, and I will show some pictures of some of the other ones. Siem Reap is a great place for going to the night markets. So there are a lot of open air night markets, again, selling just wonderful fresh fruits, foods, beautiful silks and handmade items. Another organization that I think is doing great work is called Artisans of Angkor, which teaches and employs a lot of local Cambodians, some of the traditional art forms that are then for sale for tourists. So a lot of the silk weaving, a lot of the sculpture. So I think that Artisans of Angkor, and it has several shops throughout Siem Reap where you can find all sorts of handmade arts and handicrafts at all range of prices, is a great complement to Cambodian Living Arts, which was my organization, which did the performing arts. But I also recommend getting outside of Siem Reap and exploring surrounding villages, village communities. There are many tours that take you to floating villages that are along the Tonle Sap, the lake, like I said, where fishing is obviously the staple there. And I think that there are even more recently ecotourism opportunities. And my last trip to Cambodia a couple of years ago looked more at these tourism opportunities, which I think are important. And I'll show a picture of here shortly. So in kind of winding down here so that we can have time for questions, these are some of the most beautiful carvings that you will see throughout the Angkor temples, but specifically in Angkor Wat. And so these are carvings of what are called the Apsara, or these deities that are part of, they're female deities that are part of the Cambodian creation story and culture. They are believed to represent fertility and feminine qualities, but you see so many of them, and they are the inspiration in many cases behind the classical dance tradition of Cambodia. So the classical dancers that are still dancing in Cambodia are almost the embodiments, living apsaras that you see throughout the temples. Also, just an exquisite carving in Angkor Wat itself, depicting the Hindu story of the churning of the sea of milk. Again, a Hindu myth rather than a Buddhist one. This is the opening gate of Angkor Thom, so another huge temple complex just to the side of Angkor Wat. This is a smaller temple called Banti Srai, but the carving in this is in sandstone and is considered to be just some of the most refined and detailed of the entire area. This temple is called Preah Vihear, and it's actually a bit of a day trip from Siem Reap, but it's on the Thai-Cambodian border. And just another example of just how far, the Angkor temple stretched in, across the empire. And so know that, you're not limited to just Angkor Wat. There just are tons of temples to be seen. But like I said, in my last trip to Cambodia, I was interested in exploring ecotourism options. And so I had the privilege to be able to go to a newly created elephant sanctuary. And this was very meaningful, especially because the elephants that were there had previously been used as a tourist attraction at Angkor Wat for tourists to take pictures of, to get on their backs, to do all of this. And, you know, it was kind of known that these elephants weren't being treated the best, and they were out in the hot sun for 12 hours a day. So in this movement then towards ecotourism and more sustainable and justice focused approaches to tourism, you now have this ecotourism venture that's really trying to focus on conservation and the well-being of the elephants. So with that, I will wrap up and turn it over to Q&A.
This has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Bobbie.
Thank you.
The first question came when you were talking about the money and was wondering if there are ATM machines.
Yes, there are. There were not as many when I lived there between 2009 and 2011. And so you had some then, but my last trip there in 2019, right before the pandemic, you do see ATMs in a lot of places. I will say that if you're going to rely on ATMs, you know, you need to make sure you're doing it in Siem Reap and Phnom Penh, because certainly the smaller cities, it's not as easy to find.
Okay. And how many problems have Cambodia had with COVID? Is it pretty serious over there?
It has been. I'd say that their more serious wave had been kind of, let's see here, from last year's kind of summer and fall period. Cambodia and Vietnam were going through a more difficult time. I'd say that it's on a little bit of a better track right now, but to enter Cambodia now, you have to be fully vaccinated and still do tests and quarantine. So, you know, just since Omicron continues to kind of spread unchecked throughout so much of the world, I don't recommend really international travel right now at all, specifically with Cambodia. But I think that Cambodia is overall has handled it much better than a lot of other places.
Okay. Another person said that she really liked the fact that the pictures, you kept them up quite a while so we could see each one. Sometimes they flash by really fast.
Yeah. Great.
I had a question. So when these temples were built, were they being built as Hindu temples originally and not Buddhist temples?
Yes, that's right. That's right. So Hinduism had been kind of the primary religion that was dominant for those first centuries. And then as the Buddhist influences came in, you start to see more Buddhist iconography but you know, because there are many similarities with Buddhist and Hindu iconography and stories, there is some overlap. But yes, originally Angkor had more of the Hindu influence, and again, a lot of that coming from India.
Okay, interesting. The dancing, is it similar to the dancing in other countries that are close? Is it similar to Vietnamese dancing or Thai dancing, or do they differ quite a bit?
Yeah, so they definitely differ. And this for Cambodians, a lot of these cultural art forms that, you know, like because the Thais colonized Cambodia, one of the first things it said that the Thais did was, and that was in the 1400s, one of the first things that they did when they sacked the Angkor Empire was that they took the dancers. So the basis of Thai, a lot of traditional Thai art forms, including the classical dance, is actually from Cambodia. But that is a very hot button issue for Cambodians and Thais, because, you know, a lot of people know better Thai culture, Thai food, Thai things. And a lot of this, like I said, is based more in the Khmer tradition. So Cambodian classical dance I would say is unmistakable, because whereas the Thai women and the Thai dancers will use, they have these kind of accentuated kind of the bending in the wrists and the fingers. The Thais will put these kind of like gold cones on their fingers but the Cambodians do not do this. You are trained from the time you are about 4 years old to have your wrist just smashed back and to move it so that it has this ultra
You can
flex.
do it.
Yeah. And so when I studied with the Cambodian dancers, I did this. I'm not as good anymore. And I don't have the flex that I did, but I did learn from them about how they have this extreme flex in their fingers, and then also in the legs. And I think that that really marks Cambodian dance apart from any other that you see in Southeast Asia.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man says that they visited a temple that was left with overgrown vines and trees. It was fascinating, but he can't remember the name of it. A movie
Yes.
was made there, he said.
That's right. So that temple is called Taprom, and it was the site where Angelina Jolie's film, the which I haven't seen, but Tomb Raider or Raiders of the Tomb, that's where it was filmed. And so I think that was like maybe in the early 2000s. And that's part of what got Angelina Jolie learning more about Cambodia and some of the issues going on there, adopting a Cambodian child. But she had filmed, that film partly takes place in Taprom, which is a very, very popular temple to visit, because you have these trees that have just grown into the temple infrastructure and that just cannot be separated out. And it makes for some really striking images. Yeah.
I'll bet. Do ordinary people go to Hindu temples for individual prayer or group worship or community gatherings?
Yeah, so I have seen, and it should be noted that when there was kind of that transition to Buddhism, and Buddhism is the dominant religion and the dominant influence in Cambodia now. Hindu had been kind of in the historic past. But for Cambodian people, it is also important going to the Angkor temples. Cambodians do not have to pay to enter. All other non-Cambodians have to pay. But I regularly would see in many of the temples offerings that were made by Cambodians, offerings of incense, offerings of fruit to some of the Buddha statues that are in there. So they are still active sites of worship. Yes.
Interesting. Sally wants to know if it's difficult for our digestive systems to adjust to the food and water.
Yeah, it can be. And, Cambodia, sometimes the street foods and, the sanitation and these are still concerns. So I would say that, it's unfortunately compared with some of the other countries where in big cities like Bangkok, it's not as much of a worry about eating street foods. Cambodia, you still need to be careful, and specifically with the water. So drinking boiled or bottled water is super important. But I would say that generally, if you see that food is hot and fresh and looks thoroughly cooked, that it shouldn't be a problem. You need to be careful with, buying kind of the fruits, the fresh tropical fruits off of the street, because oftentimes they can be washed with water or contaminated with water.
Oh.
So my suggestion is just buying the fruit and then taking that back to your hotel, or, making sure you're washing it with bottled water.
Well, this has been fascinating, and several people have said thank you and that it was a wonderful presentation, and I heartily agree. Thank you so much, Bobbie.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
I hope that you will join us again sometime.
Yes, sounds good.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.